Hey, it's Maxwell Mosu. Last week was a crazy Monday because 25 years later, people are still talking about the mythological being from the Stone Age known as Sega. So the Sega Saturn turned 25 years old. Just another story of how a video game titan piloted their giant mechanical ego into the depths of hell itself. They sinned the ultimate sin. They lied through their teeth to beat the competition. This was the story of Saturn Day, May 11th, 1995.
What else can go wrong?
Urgent synapse on line 2. It's the sphincter.
What is going on up there?
Sega Saturn.
This was a day deemed holy by the Sega overlords. It was their time to cripple the competition because back home, Sony was making waves. The PlayStation was out, Sega was scared, and they were ready for retaliation. Every video game company at the time was at a turning point. You turned the page, and guess what? We're in the new age. We've got 3D, 2D, everything you've ever wanted. You have to grip America by the balls. And while Sega had already done this initially with the Sega Genesis, their popularity was waning because they kept releasing dumber and dumber add-ons, just life support add-ons that were killing it, killing themselves. Sony was new, and they were fresh, they had a pedigree in electronics. People loved Sony, so the idea of a Sony video game console made people lose their skulls. Enter E3, May 11th, 1995. The first E3, the video gaming expo to rule them all. The big dogs were all here, and Sega was setting a precedent for insane reveal.
Experience Sega Saturn's monster torque and parallel processing power. All the speed and handling you'd expect. And every inch a Sega.
The original intention was for the Saturn to be released on September 2nd, 1995, but the big bosses in Japan sitting in their high tower decided no. May 11th, 1995.
It's how you play the game.
Now, if you think about it, this was a gamble. They were showing off what the Saturn was capable of, so releasing it that same day, so far ahead of time, instead of building up that anticipation, similar to what PlayStation was already doing, could potentially backfire.
Yeah.
They probably thought, the people would proclaim Sega is back. But at the end of the presentation, they dropped a rather high price point of $399, which is around $675 by modern day standards.
Sega Saturn is the newest and most indulgent taste temptation from Sega.
Sega stood proudly from the church doorsteps and bellowed, God himself has brought thee sweet Saturn waters for you to sip. Take your kids to Toys R Us so you can receive your holy Sega baptism from Jeffrey the Giraffe himself.
Jeffrey, are you sure about this?
Sony knew that Sega had already dug their own grave. They didn't provide any elaborate presentation. They walked on stage, said $299, and walked off.
$299.
While the Saturn did turn out to be a monumental failure in America, it was absolutely beloved in Japan. To put it into perspective, only 258 games were released for the Saturn in America, while over 1,265 games were released in Japan. The difference was staggering. I always wanted a Sega Saturn. It was my white whale of video game consoles ever since I was a kid. I had a Sega Genesis and I had a Sega Dreamcast, but there was that missing link in between. A caveman missing link, an ooga booga. When my mom finally stopped carrying me around like a piece of luggage and I was left to stay home alone, I would try to schmooze my way into getting a Sega Saturn. I'd try to surprise her when she came home, doing every chore you could possibly imagine. But to no avail, I just couldn't get a Saturn into my hands. So, over 15 years later, I got a Saturn. And was it as good as Sega made it out to be? Well, to an extent, but most of the library of games that the Saturn provides are Japanese imports. Plus, if you've waited this long to actually invest in a Saturn, all of the games are pretty expensive. And I don't mean baby expensive. I mean, they can go for hundreds to almost thousands of dollars. It's absurd. So you'd be better off figuring out a way to either hack your system or trick it into reading burned discs. The Saturn, honestly, is like the hidden library of Alexandria. You're going to see some amazing arcade-perfect ports, just absolutely weirdo ideas that only Japan could come up with, and a bunch of RPGs that you didn't think would have ever seen the light of day. So sit down with me, Maxwell Mosu, your redhead best friend, and we're going to play a $500 game that I don't even own, but it's on my Sega Saturn, and it's called Hyperduel. It spoke to me as soon as I booted it up. Space shooter, banging soundtrack, can transform into a mech at will. It's an arcade-perfect port. 2 modes, arcade mode, and you've got the Saturn mode, which adds a whole bunch of extra goodies. I hope you enjoy watching as much as I do playing. This is Maxwell Mosu. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Long live the mythological being that is the Sega Saturn. I'll see you in the next one.